Some mistakes leave a bruise, others rearrange your entire life. When Oakhaven High's most arrogant bullies cornered the quiet kid by the bleachers, they thought they were just having fun. They had no idea his older brother wore the winged death head of the Hells Angels. They were dead wrong. Oakhaven High School was the kind of pristine, manicured California campus where wealth dictated your social survival. If your parents were doctors, lawyers, or local real estate moguls, you walked the halls like royalty. If you were Toby Reynolds, you practically didn't exist. At 15, Toby was undersized, introverted, and chronically invisible. He wore faded Levi's, scuffed work boots that were 2 sizes too big, and a battered denim jacket. While the other kids debated where they were spending their spring breaks, Toby spent his free periods sitting beneath the oak tree near the football field, his nose buried in a thick, leather-bound sketchbook. He didn't bother anyone. He just wanted to survive the 4 years of high school and get out. But in an ecosystem ruled by predators, being quiet is often mistaken for being weak. The apex predator of Oakhaven High was Trent Lawson. Trent was 17, the captain of the varsity football team, and the son of Richard Lawson, a man who owned half the commercial real estate in the county. Trent drove a brand-new BMW his father had bought him for getting a C average, and he walked with the arrogant swagger of a boy who had never been told no in his entire life. He was backed by his 2 shadows, Brad Higgins, a hulking linebacker with a mean streak, and Derek Shaw, a wiry, cruel-mouthed kid who lived to laugh at other people's misery for the first 2 months of the semester. Trent ignored Toby, but bullies have a radar for isolation. It started small, a shoulder check in the hallway that sent Toby's books scattering across the linoleum, a stumbled foot in the cafeteria that resulted in Toby's lunch tray clattering to the floor. Through it all, Toby did exactly what he had been taught to do. He picked up his things, kept his mouth shut, and walked away. What Trent didn't understand was that Toby wasn't walking away out of fear. He was walking away out of preservation. Toby knew something about violence that Trent, in his sheltered country club life, could never comprehend. Toby lived in a dilapidated 2-bedroom house on the industrial edge of town, right near the county line. He didn't have a father to buy him a BMW or a mother to pack his lunches. They had both died in a car pileup on Interstate 5 when Toby was 7. The only family Toby had left was his older brother, Jax. Jax Reynolds wasn't a PTA meeting kind of guardian. He was 28 years old, stood 6'3", and his arms were covered in ink that told stories polite society didn't want to hear. Jax was a fully patched member of the Hells Angels motorcycle club. When their parents died, the state had tried to put Toby in the foster system. Jax, who was just 20 at the time and already prospecting for the local charter, had fought like a rabid dog to keep his little brother. He took on grueling shifts at a local auto shop, proved he could provide a stable roof, and leaned on the Brotherhood of the club to help him navigate the legal red tape to the world. Jax Reaper. Reynolds was a terrifying figure. He rode a heavily modified Harley-Davidson Dyna, wore a leather cut adorned with the notorious winged death head and the 1% diamond patch, and carried an aura of absolute, uncompromising danger. But to Toby, Jax was the man who made sure there was hot food on the table, who checked his math homework with grease-stained fingers, and who had bought him that leather-bound sketchbook for his 15th birthday. You keep your head down in that rich kid school. Tobe, Jax had told him one evening, leaning against the frame of his Harley, a cigarette dangling from his lips. You get your education, You don't let them drag you into their drama. But if a man ever puts his hands on you, you let me know. We don't start fires, but we damn sure burn down the house if someone brings a match to ours." Toby had taken those words to heart. He absorbed Trent's petty harassments because he knew that if Jax ever found out, the retaliation wouldn't be a call to the principal's office. It would be catastrophic. The Hells Angels didn't operate on the rules of high school suspensions. They operated on respect, consequence, and a brutal code of loyalty. But Trent Lawson was getting bored. The minor bullying wasn't yielding the tears or the cowering submission he craved. Toby's stoic, silent glaring infuriated him. It made Trent feel small, and Trent hated feeling small. The tension simmered through November. Trent began to escalate. He started cornering Toby in the locker room before gym class, taunting him about his clothes. "Hey, Reynolds, you get those boots off a dead homeless guy." Brad and Derek would snicker like hyenas. Toby would just tie his sneakers, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached, and walk out. One afternoon, during a free period, Trent noticed Toby sketching under the oak tree. Trent marched over, Brad and Derek flanking him. "What are you always drawing in that stupid book, freak?" Trent demanded, snatching the sketchbook from Toby's hands. Toby stood up instantly, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Give it back, Trent." Trent flipped through the heavy, cream-colored pages. They were filled with intricate, masterful charcoal sketches of motorcycles, choppers, baggers, custom builds. Toby had a gift. He poured all his love for his brother and his brother's world into those pages. "Bikes!" Trent scoffed, a nasty smirk spreading across his face. "What do you think you're, some kind of tough biker trash? You're a joke, Reynolds. You probably take the bus." I said, "Give it back." Toby stepped forward, his voice dropping an octave. Trent shoved him hard in the chest. Toby stumbled backward, hitting the trunk of the oak tree. "Or what you're gonna cry, tell your daddy." "Oh wait, you don't have one." The cruelty was casual, tossed out like garbage. Brad and Derek howled with laughter. Trent threw the sketchbook into a nearby muddy puddle left over from the morning rain. He stepped on it, twisting his expensive sneaker into the leather cover, and then walked away, leaving Toby standing there, his hands shaking with a mix of profound grief and a terrifying, suppressed rage. Toby knelt in the mud and picked up the ruined book. The water had seeped through the edges, smudging the charcoal, ruining hours of work. It was the one beautiful thing he owned, a symbol of his brother's love, desecrated by a boy who had everything. Toby didn't tell Jax that night. He dried the pages with a hairdryer, hiding the evidence. He thought he could handle it. He thought he could just survive. He was wrong. The blood in the water had been sensed, and the sharks were circling. The incident that pushed everything over the edge happened on a dreary, grey Tuesday. The sky over Oakhaven was bruised with heavy rain clouds, matching the oppressive atmosphere inside the school. Gym class had ended, and the boys' locker room was emptying out. Toby intentionally lingered on the benches, pretending to struggle with a knot in his shoelace, waiting for the room to clear. He just wanted to change in peace and catch the bus back to the edge of town. But Trent, Brad, and Derek had also lingered. They were huddled near the showers, whispering, as the heavy metal doors banged shut behind the last departing student. The ambient noise of the locker room faded into a tense, echoing silence. Toby grabbed his bag and stood up, making a beeline for the exit. Brad Higgins stepped out, blocking the aisle. at 220 pounds of pure muscle. He was a wall of meat and malice. "Where are you going?" "Reynolds. We're not done hanging out." Toby tried to sidestep him. "Move! Brad!" From behind, Derek shoved Toby hard between the shoulder blades. Toby pitched forward, dropping his bag. As it hit the tiled floor, the zipper burst open. Out tumbled his textbooks, a few pens, and the water-warped, leather-bound sketchbook. Trent walked over slowly, his cleats clacking against the wet tiles. He looked down at the sketchbook, then up at Toby. His eyes were devoid of any real humanity, just a bored teenager looking for a distraction. "I thought I put that piece of trash where it belonged," Trent sneered. He kicked the sketchbook across the floor. It skidded and hit the wall near the showers. Something inside Toby snapped. It wasn't just the bullying anymore. It was the blatant disrespect for the one thing that anchored him. He didn't think about his size, or the fact that it was 3 against 1. He launched himself at Trent, tackling the larger boy around the waist. For a split second, Trent was genuinely shocked as he crashed to the hard floor. Toby on top of him. Toby managed to land one solid, desperate punch to Trent's jaw. Then, the world caved in on him. Brad grabbed Toby by the collar of his denim jacket and hauled him backward, slamming him brutally into a row of metal lockers. The impact knocked the wind out of Toby's lungs in a sickening gasp. Before he could slide to the floor, Derek punched him in the stomach. Trent scrambled to his feet, his face red with fury. He touched his jaw, feeling the sting. The golden boy had been struck by the invisible kid. His ego couldn't handle it. "Hold him!" Trent hissed. Brad pinned Toby's arms against the lockers. Toby struggled frantically, kicking and twisting, but he was no match for the linebacker's strength. Trent stepped up and drove his fist into Toby's eye. The crack of knuckles against bone echoed sharply in the damp room. Toby groaned, his vision flashing brilliantly white, then swirling with dark spots. "You think you can touch me?" Trent spat, punching him again, this time in the ribs. Toby heard a sickening pop, and a flare of agonizing pain radiated through his side. They didn't stop there. For 3 agonizing minutes, they used Toby as a punching bag. Derek kicked the back of his knees, bringing him down to the wet tile, and Trent delivered a final, vicious kick to Toby's side as he lay curled in a fetal position, desperately trying to protect his head. "Let's go!" Trent finally panted, shaking out his hand. "Leave the trash where it is." They grabbed their gym bags. On his way out, Trent picked up Toby's sketchbook, ripped a handful of pages out of the center, and let them flutter down onto Toby's bruised and bleeding body. The heavy metal door slammed shut, leaving Toby alone in the deafening silence of the locker room. It took Toby 20 minutes just to stand up. His left eye was already swollen shut, a deep purplish-black mass. His lip was split, dripping blood onto his chin. Every breath he took felt like a rusty knife twisting between his ribs. Slowly, painstakingly, he gathered the torn pages of his sketchbook, shoved them into his bag, and dragged himself out of the school. He didn't take the bus. He couldn't let anyone see him like this. He walked the 3 miles home in the freezing drizzle, clutching his side, praying to whatever God was listening that Jax would be at the clubhouse and not at home. If he could just get to the bathroom, ice his face, and hide in his room, he could lie and say he fell off his bike. But luck was never on Toby's side. As he turned onto his street, he heard the deep, unmistakable, rhythmic rumble of a V-twin engine. Sitting in the driveway of their small house, gleaming under the porch light, was Jax's diner. Toby froze. His heart hammered, sending fresh waves of pain through his broken ribs. He considered turning around and sleeping in the woods. But it was raining harder now. He had no choice. He pulled the collar of his jacket up, kept his head down, and unlocked the front door. The house smelled of stale coffee, leather, and gun scrubber. Jax was sitting at the small kitchen table, a disassembled carburetor laid out on a towel in front of him. He was wearing a plain black t-shirt, his heavily tattooed arms corded with muscle as he worked a small screwdriver. His leather cut hung over the back of his chair, the crimson and gold Hell's Angels patches glowing under the cheap fluorescent kitchen light. "You're late," Jax said, without looking up, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. "Dinner's on the stove." "Bus ran late," Toby mumbled, keeping his back to his brother as he made a beeline for the hallway. Jax paused. The screwdriver stopped moving. In the MC world, survival depends on hyper-awareness. You notice when the air changes in a room. You notice when a voice trembles. "Toby, stop." Toby froze at the edge of the hallway. Jax set the tool down. The scrape of his chair pushing back sounded like a gunshot in the quiet house. Heavy boots crossed the linoleum floor. Jax clamped a massive hand on Toby's shoulder and turned him around. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. Jax looked at his little brother. He took in the swollen, black and blue eye, the crusted blood on his split lip, the pale, clammy skin, and the way Toby was hunched over, clutching his ribs. Jax didn't yell. He didn't gasp. His face went entirely blank. It was a terrifying, dead-eyed stillness that Toby had only seen once before the night a rival crew had tried to firebomb the MC's clubhouse. It was the face of the Reaper. "Who?" Jax said. It wasn't a question. It was a command. I fell. Jax, I was walking by the bleachers and I tripped." "Do not lie to me." Jax's voice dropped dangerously low, vibrating with a lethal, barely contained fury. "Look at my eyes. Toby, tell me who did this to you." Toby started to cry. The pain, the humiliation, the exhaustion, it all flooded out. He dropped his bag, and it fell open. The torn, muddy pages of the sketchbook spilled onto the floor between Jax's boots. Jax slowly knelt down. He picked up a torn page. It was a charcoal drawing of Jax on his Harley. There was a bloody boot print right in the center of the paper. Jax stood up, his jaw ticking. "Give me the names." "Jax, please," Toby sobbed, terrified of what his brother would do. "They're rich kids. Their parents run the town. You can't, you'll go to jail." "Names. Trent," Toby whispered. "Defeated. Trent Lawson, Brad Higgins, Derek Shaw." Jax committed the names to memory. He reached out with a surprisingly gentle hand and wiped a tear from Toby's uninjured eye. "Go to the bathroom. Get the first aid kit. I'm taking you to Doc Henderson to get those ribs taped up." Doc Henderson was an old physician who kept off-the-books hours for the club. "What are you going to do?" Toby asked, his voice shaking. Jax turned away, walking over to the kitchen chair. He picked up his leather cut and slipped it over his shoulders, the death head settling heavily onto his back. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket. "I'm going to make a phone call," Jax said, dialing a number. The phone rang once before a deep voice answered on the other end. "Yeah, brother," the voice said. It was big. Dan Miller, the sergeant-at-arms for the charter. "Dan, call a church meeting." "Tonight?" Jack said. his eyes locked onto the bloody boot print on the drawing. "We have a local pest control issue, and tell the boys. We're riding heavy." The Hells Angels clubhouse sat on a sprawling, fenced-in compound just outside the city limits. It was a fortress of corrugated steel, cinder block, and high-definition security cameras. Inside, the main hall smelled of stale beer, motor oil, and cheap cigar smoke. By midnight, the long, heavy oak table in the center of the room was surrounded by 20 fully patched members. The atmosphere was thick with a dangerous, electric tension. Jax stood at the head of the table, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the wood. He had just finished telling them what happened to Toby. He laid the bloody, boot-printed drawing on the table like a piece of damning evidence in a murder trial. At the opposite end of the table sat Clay Donovan. Clay was the president of the charter, a 55-year-old veteran biker with a silver beard, eyes like chipped flint, and a mind like a steel trap. He had spent his life navigating the treacherous waters of outlaw motorcycle clubs and the federal agents who hunted them. He didn't survive this long by being reckless. "3 rich kids," Clay rumbled, his voice cutting through the angry murmurs of the room. "And one of them is Richard Lawson's boy. I don't give a damn if he's the mayor's boy. Clay!" Jax growled, his chest heaving. "They broke his ribs. They nearly blinded his left eye. I want permission to handle it." Big Dan Miller, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, shook his massive head. "You lay a finger on those kids, Jax, and the local PD will have an excuse to raid this compound by morning. Lawson has the police chief in his back pocket. It's a bad play." "So what?" Jax snapped, slamming his fist on the table. "I do nothing. I let them use my blood like a punching bag." Nobody said nothing. "Brother," Clay said softly. The room instantly fell dead silent. When Clay spoke quietly, it meant someone's world was about to end. "We are Hell's Angels. We don't throw cheap punches in a schoolyard. We dismantle lives. We go after the roots." Clay looked over at a younger, scruffy biker sitting behind a glowing laptop in the corner. His road name was Wyatt, and before he had found the Brotherhood, he had been a highly skilled corporate IT specialist. "Wyatt," Clay ordered, "dig into Richard Lawson. I want everything. Tax returns, offshore accounts, property deeds, phone records. A man who owns half the county doesn't get there playing by the rules. Find the rot. For 48 hours. The club moved in complete silence. Toby stayed home from school, nursing his injuries under Jax's watchful eye. He was terrified of the impending violence, but Jax reassured him that the club had a plan. Meanwhile, Wyatt struck gold. On Thursday night, Wyatt projected a series of documents onto the white wall of the clubhouse. "Richard Lawson isn't just a bully's father," Wyatt explained, tapping his keyboard. "He's a ghost landlord. He's been buying up low-income housing on the east side, evicting the tenants illegally, and selling the land to a commercial developer at a massive markup. But here's the twist: he's been using non-union, undocumented labor to do the demolitions, paying them cash under the table, and cooking his books to hide the money." Clay leaned forward, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his weathered face. "Tax evasion, real estate fraud, money laundering. It gets better," Wyatt smirked. 2 of the contracting firms he screwed over last year. They pay protection to the local Russian syndicate. Lawson owes the Brat for nearly $2 million, and he's been dodging their phone calls. The room erupted into low, menacing laughter. Richard Lawson had built a house of cards. "All right." Clay stood up, adjusting his leather cut. Jax, you and the boys are going to have a little chat with the high schoolers. Scare the absolute hell out of them. But do not leave a mark. Dan and I are going to pay Mr. Lawson a visit at his corporate office. We're going to show him exactly what happens when his spoiled kid brings a war to our doorstep. Friday afternoon at Oakhaven High School was usually a scene of chaotic joy. The final bell rang, and hundreds of privileged teenagers flooded out of the double-glass doors, eager for the weekend. Trent Lawson, Brad, and Derek swaggered toward the student parking lot, laughing loudly. Trent was tossing the keys to his BMW in the air. "Party at my dad's lake house this weekend," Trent bragged. "Half the cheerleading squad is coming." They never made it to the car. A low, thunderous vibration began to shake the asphalt. It started as a distant rumble and quickly grew into an ear-splitting, mechanical roar. The students in the parking lot froze, turning their heads toward the entrance. Rolling up the main driveway, in a tight, disciplined V formation, were 50 heavily customized Harley-Davidsons. The sun glinted off the chrome exhaust pipes and the menacing, winged death head patches on the backs of their leather cuts. The sheer volume of the V-twin engines was deafening, vibrating in the chests of everyone standing there. The security guards at the front gate took one look at the procession and wisely stepped back, reaching for their radios but doing nothing to stop them. The bikers didn't rev their engines or shout. They operated with terrifying, military precision. They rolled into the parking lot and formed a massive, impenetrable circle completely surrounding Trent's BMW. Kickstands went down in unison with a loud cluck. The engines were killed, and a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the entire schoolyard. 50 grown men, covered in tattoos and wearing the colors of the most notorious motorcycle club in the world, sat silently on their bikes, staring at 3 terrified teenagers. Trent's face drained of all color. The arrogant swagger evaporated instantly. Brad Higgins, the hulking linebacker, looked like he was about to vomit. Derek was visibly shaking. From the center of the formation, Jax dismounted. He didn't rush. He walked with heavy, deliberate steps toward the 3 boys. He towered over Trent, his dark eyes burning with a cold, terrifying fire. "You're Trent," Jax said. His voice wasn't loud, but in the dead silence of the parking lot, it carried perfectly. I... Trent stammered, his eyes darting frantically for help. No one was coming. The teachers, the students, the security, they were all paralyzed. "I'm Toby Reynolds' older brother," Jax stated, stopping inches from Trent's face. "I saw what you did to his ribs. I saw what you did to his eye." "It was a mistake," Trent whispered, tears of sheer panic welling in his eyes. "We were just messing around." Jax reached out, moving so fast Trent flinched violently, expecting a punch. Instead, Jax simply grabbed the collar of Trent's expensive polo shirt, pulling him in close. "Listen to me very carefully, because I will only say this once," Jax whispered, his voice a razor blade. "If you, or your friends, ever look at my brother again, if you breathe the same air as him, if you so much as walk down the same hallway, I won't just beat you. I will follow you into the dark, and I will take away everything you have ever loved. Do we have an understanding?" Trent nodded frantically, a pathetic sob escaping his throat. "Good." Jax released him, slapping his chest lightly. "Now go home and ask your daddy how his afternoon went." At that exact moment, across town, in a sleek, glass-walled office, Richard Lawson was sweating through his tailored Italian suit. Clay Donovan and Big Dan Miller were sitting on the plush leather sofas in Lawson's office. The door was locked. Lawson's personal security detail was lying unconscious in the hallway. Clay tossed a heavy black USB flash drive onto Lawson's mahogany desk. "What is this?" Lawson demanded, his voice trembling as he looked at the two massive bikers. "You can't just barge in here. That drive," Clay said calmly, lighting a thick cigar, "contains every deleted email, every hidden offshore account, and the exact locations of the undocumented workers you've been exploiting. It also contains the financial ledgers proving you stole $2 million from the Russian mob." Lawson's jaw dropped. The blood vanished from his face. "Your son, Trent, severely beat a boy named Toby Reynolds," Clay continued, blowing a stream of blue smoke toward the ceiling. "Toby is under the protection of the Hells Angels. Your boy brought a world of hurt down on your head. Richard—" "I'll pay you," Lawson blurted out, panic fully taking over. "Whatever you want. 100,000, 200. Dan laughed, a deep, rumbling sound. "We don't want your dirty money. Suit. Here are our terms." Clay leaned forward, his eyes turning lethal. "You are going to quietly sell your real estate holdings in this town. You are going to take your family, and you are going to move out of this state by the end of the month. If you stay, that flash drive goes to the FBI, and a copy goes to the Bratva." Lawson slumped in his chair. A broken man. His empire, his reputation, his entire life in Oakhaven destroyed in a single afternoon because his son couldn't leave a quiet kid alone. "You have 30 days. Richard," Clay said, standing up. "Start packing." The following Monday. Toby walked through the front doors of Oakhaven High School. The bruising around his eye was fading to a dull yellow, and his ribs were tightly wrapped. But he walked a little taller. As he walked down the main hallway, the sea of students parted. There were no whispers. There were no snickers. There was only absolute, profound respect born of absolute terror. Trent, Brad, and Derek were nowhere to be seen. Rumor had it they had been abruptly unenrolled, and the Lawson family's sprawling estate had a "for sale" sign hammered into the manicured lawn over the weekend. Toby walked out to the football field during his free period. He sat down under his favorite oak tree. Reaching into his bag, he pulled out a brand-new, beautiful leather-bound sketchbook. Jax had given it to him the night before. Toby opened to the first blank page, picked up his charcoal pencil, and began to draw a winged death head, sketching the emblem of the men who had shown the world that true power isn't about how loud you shout. It's about the shadows that stand silently behind you. Wow, what an incredible twist bullying the quiet kid cost an entire family their corrupt empire. If you enjoyed this intense, real-life story of karma, loyalty, and the ultimate payback, please hit that like button, share and subscribe to the channel.
A 9-year-old girl, clutching a crumpled funeral flyer, walked straight up to a 250-pound Hell's Angel covered in tattoos and made an impossible request. What followed wasn't a scene from a movie. It was a thunderous 700-motorcycle spectacle that shook an entire town to its core and redefined Brotherhood. It was a blistering Tuesday afternoon in July, the kind of day in Aldale, California, where the heat waves off the asphalt made the horizon blur and dance. At pump number 4 of a rundown Texaco station, Arthur Bears Sterling was topping off the tank of his customized Harley-Davidson Road King. Bear was not a man people approached lightly, standing 6'4" with arms thicker than most men's thighs, a thick, graying beard, and the infamous death head patch of the Hells Angels motorcycle club stitched onto the back of his heavy leather cut. He was the very picture of intimidation. Bear was minding his own business, wiping a speck of oil off his chrome exhaust, when he felt a faint, hesitant tap on his leather vest. He turned, his brow furrowed in a natural scowl, fully expecting a local panhandler or a teenager looking for trouble. Instead, his eyes had to travel downward way down to meet the gaze of a little girl. She couldn't have been older than 9. She wore faded denim overalls, scuffed Converse sneakers, and her blonde hair was pulled into a messy ponytail. Her face was streaked with dirt and dried tears, and her lower lip was trembling so hard she had to bite it to keep it still. "Excuse me, mister," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the idle rumble of a passing truck. Bear slowly straightened up, towering over her like a redwood tree. He glanced around the desolate gas station. "Where's your folks, kid? You lost?" The girl shook her head, holding out a single crumpled piece of cheap printer paper. Her small hands were shaking. Bear reluctantly took the paper. It was a hastily made funeral announcement. A blurry black-and-white photo of a teenage boy smiled back at him. Beneath it, the text read, "In loving memory of Daniel Miller, 2010-2026. That's my big brother," the girl said, her voice cracking. "My name is Chloe." Bear looked at the flyer, then back down at Chloe. "I'm sorry for your loss, Chloe. But why are you showing this to me?" Chloe sniffled, rubbing her nose with the back of her dirty hand. Daniel loved motorcycles. He had magazines all over his room. He used to sit on the porch and watch you guys ride by on the highway. He said one day he was going to get a bike and ride away from this place. Bear's hardened expression softened just a fraction. He knew the allure of the road, the promise of freedom it held for kids trapped in dead-end towns. "Sounds like he had good taste," Bear rumbled gently. "But you shouldn't be out here alone." "I need your help," Chloe blurted out, the tears finally spilling over her eyelashes. "The funeral is this Friday at the old St. Jude's Chapel on the edge of town. But nobody is coming." Bear frowned, crouching down so he was closer to her eye level. The leather of his cut creaked. "What do you mean nobody's coming?" "Funerals are usually packed with family and friends." Chloe shook her head violently, sobbing now. "We don't have family. My dad left a long time ago, and my mom, she hasn't gotten out of bed since Daniel died, and Daniel didn't have any friends left. The kids at his high school, they were really mean to him, mister. We don't have a lot of money, and they made fun of his clothes. They pushed him into lockers. They posted awful things about him on the internet." She paused, struggling to catch her breath, and the next words she spoke hit Bear like a physical blow to the chest. They were so mean to him that Daniel decided he didn't want to live anymore. He hurt himself last week. He's gone. Chloe looked up into the biker's eyes, her own filled with a desperate, crushing sorrow that no child should ever carry. "The school isn't doing anything. The parents of the boys who bullied him told everyone in our neighborhood not to go to the funeral, so they wouldn't look bad. The church is going to be empty, and the funeral director said we need 6 people to carry his heavy box." She stepped closer, placing a tiny hand on Bear's massive, tattooed forearm. Mister, can you carry my brother's casket? Please. I don't want him to go into the ground all alone. Not Sutcore." For a long, agonizing moment, the gas station was completely silent, save for the hum of the fluorescent lights above. Bear, a man who had seen the darkest corners of the world, who'd lived a life of violence, brotherhood, and harsh realities, felt a sudden, sharp lump form in his throat. He looked at the little girl's desperate grip on his arm. He thought of his own childhood, of the cruelties of the world, and of the sacred weight of carrying a brother to his final rest. The Hells Angels are fiercely protective of their own, but they are not a charity organization. They operate by their own strict code. Yet looking into Chloe's tear-filled eyes, the code shifted. Bear gently placed his large calloused hand over hers. "What time Friday, Chloe?" 10 in the morning, she whispered. "You go home. You take care of your mom," Bear said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He folded the flyer and slipped it carefully into the breast pocket of his cut, right over his heart. "Your brother won't be alone. I promise you that." 30 minutes later, the heavy oak doors of the Hells Angels local charter clubhouse swung open. The air inside was thick with cigarette smoke, the smell of stale beer, and the low murmur of deep voices. At the far end of the long wooden table sat William Dutch Hollister, the president of the charter. Dutch was a veteran of the road, a man whose word was absolute law within the club. Bear walked the length of the room, the heavy thud of his boots drawing the attention of the patched members lounging around the pool table and the bar. He didn't say a word until he reached the head of the table. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the crumpled flyer, and flattened it out on the wood in front of Dutch. Dutch took a slow drag from his cigarette, exhaling a thick plume of grey smoke before looking down at the paper. "Who's the kid, Bear?" His name was Daniel, Bear said, his voice echoing slightly in the sudden quiet of the room. 16 years old. Hanged himself in his bedroom last Thursday. A murmur rippled through the room. The men gathered closer. Bear recounted the story exactly as Chloe had told him. He spoke of the grinding poverty, the relentless, cruel bullying by the wealthy kids at the local high school, the mother paralyzed by grief, and the ultimate, devastating twist, the town's collective decision to sweep the tragedy under the rug. He explained how the Bullies' families had pressured the community to boycott the funeral to avoid a scandal, leaving a 9-year-old girl wandering the streets begging strangers to be pallbearers for her dead brother. When Bear finished, the silence in the clubhouse was deafening. The anger in the room was palpable, a heavy, suffocating pressure. These were men who lived outside the bounds of polite society, men who had been judged and shunned themselves. They possessed a visceral hatred for bullies and cowards. Dutch stared intently at the blurry photo of the smiling teenager. For a long time, he didn't move. What none of the newer members knew but Bear remembered vividly was that 20 years ago, Dutch's own nephew had taken his life under terrifyingly similar circumstances. The old wounds, long scarred over by time and leather, suddenly tore wide open. Dutch slowly stubbed out a cigarette in a heavy glass ashtray. He looked up, his eyes cold and hard as flint. "The funeral is Friday morning at 10. Dutch asked. "Yeah," Bear nodded. "At St. Jude's." "Zur. The little girl just wanted me and maybe a few of the guys to carry the casket, just so he wouldn't go out alone." Dutch stood up, pushing his chair back with a loud scrape. He picked up the flyer. A kid who loved the road, hunted down by cowards until he couldn't take it anymore. And now they want to erase him like he never existed. Dutch's voice began to rise, vibrating with a terrifying, righteous fury. They want him to go quietly. They want to pretend this didn't happen. Dutch turned to his sergeant-at-arms, a massive man known as Iron Mike. "Mike, get on the horn. Call the presidents in Oakland. Call San Jose. Call the nomads out in Nevada. Send this flyer to every charter up and down the West Coast." Bear's eyes widened slightly. "Dutch, you want to involve the coast." "I don't want just 6 guys carrying this boy," Dutch roared, slamming his fist onto the table. "I want the whole damn world to know his name. I want those bullies and their miserable parents to look out their windows on Friday morning and shake in their boots. We're going to give Daniel Miller the loudest, proudest, most earth-shattering send-off this state has ever seen." Over the next 48 hours, an unprecedented mobilization occurred. Word spread through the highly organized, tightly knit underworld of the Hells Angels with astonishing speed. The story of the bullied boy and the brave little sister struck a nerve that transcended charter lines and state borders. Phones rang incessantly in clubhouses from Los Angeles to the Pacific Northwest. Mechanics worked through the night, tuning engines and polishing chrome. The call to ride wasn't an obligation. It became a point of fierce honor. No club member was going to let that boy be buried in silence. Meanwhile, back in Oildale, Thursday night settled over the town with a stifling, ignorant calm. The parents of the Bullies sat in their air-conditioned homes, sipping wine, confident that their pressure campaign had worked. They believed Friday would come and go quietly, the embarrassing tragedy buried along with the poor kid from the wrong side of the tracks. At a small, dilapidated house on the edge of town, Chloe sat on her front porch under a flickering yellow bud light. She hugged her knees to her chest, looking down the empty, dark street. She wondered if the giant man with the beard had forgotten about her. She wondered if anyone would come at all. What Chloe didn't know, what the entire town of Oildale couldn't possibly comprehend, was that under the cover of darkness, hundreds of miles of highway were currently vibrating. Convoys of heavy American steel were already on the move, cutting through the night like a mechanical army. From the coastal highways to the desert interstates, they were converging on the small, unsuspecting town. The storm was coming, and it wore leather. Friday morning in Oildale dawned bright, cloudless, and painfully ordinary. At the local country club diner on the wealthy west side of town, Richard Preston sat in a plush leather booth, cutting into a plate of steak and eggs. Richard was a prominent local real estate developer and, more importantly to this story, the father of Bradley Preston. Bradley was the star quarterback of the high school football team, the golden boy of the town, and the primary architect of the relentless torment that had driven Daniel Miller to his grave. Across the table sat Principal Higgins, nervously stirring his coffee. "You're sure this will all blow over quietly, Richard?" Higgins asked, dabbing his forehead with a napkin. "The school board is terrified of the liability. If the press gets wind of the cyberbullying." Richard waved his fork dismissively, chewing a piece of steak. "Relax, Higgins. The Miller family has no money and no connections. The mother is a basket case, and the father has been out of the picture for a decade. I've spoken to the right people. Nobody is going to that funeral today. By Monday, this whole unfortunate incident will be old news, and Bradley's scholarship prospects won't be tainted by some fragile kid from the trailer park." 2 miles away, at St. Jude's, a crumbling, weathered chapel with peeling white paint and the sagging roof, the reality was far bleaker. The parking lot was entirely empty, save for a rusted hearse and a beaten-up Ford sedan. Inside the stiflingly hot church, the silence was suffocating. Mr. Abernathy, the elderly funeral director, stood near the altar, looking at his watch with a heavy sigh. Resting on a cheap metal stand was the least expensive casket the parlor offered, a simple pine box painted dark brown. In the front pew sat Sarah Miller, Daniel's mother. She looked entirely broken, staring blankly at the wooden box holding her son. Her face was hollowed out by grief, her eyes red and vacant. Beside her sat 9-year-old Chloe, wearing her only nice dress, a faded, floral hand-me-down that was a size too big. She kept looking back over her shoulder at the heavy wooden doors of the church, her small hands twisting the fabric of her skirt into tight knots. "Mrs. Miller, Mr. Mother," Abernathy said softly, stepping down from the altar. "It's 9:45. We really need to proceed, but we have a logistical problem. I need 6 able-bodied men to carry the casket to the gravesite out back. My assistant called in sick, and it's just me." Sarah Miller didn't blink. She just pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her thin shoulders, the absolute picture of defeat. "They're coming," Chloe piped up, her voice trembling but defiant. "My friends are coming, Mr. Chior." Abernathy gave the little girl the pitying, sorrowful look. "Sweetheart, I don't think anyone else is coming." At exactly 9:50 a.m., the coffee in Richard Preston's cup back at the diner began to vibrate. It started as a low, almost imperceptible hum that you felt in your chest before you heard it with your ears. Principal Higgins paused mid-sentence, looking around as the silverware on their table began to rattle against the porcelain plates. "Is that an earthquake?" Higgins asked, gripping the edge of the table. But it wasn't the earth shifting beneath tectonic plates. It was the synchronized combustion of hundreds of heavy-duty Vitz twin engines. Back at St. Jude's, the stained glass windows of the old chapel began to violently buzz in their lead frames. Mr. Abernethy froze, looking up at the ceiling in alarm. Chloe jumped up from the pew, a sudden bright spark of hope lighting up her tear-streaked face. She sprinted down the center aisle and pushed open the heavy oak doors. What she saw, and what the entire town of Oildale was suddenly waking up to, was a spectacle of biblical proportions. Cresting the hill on Route 46, a river of chrome black leather and roaring steel poured into the valley. It wasn't 10 bikes, it wasn't 50 bikes. It was an endless, terrifyingly disciplined cavalry of 700 Hell's Angels. They rode in a tight, staggered formation, the massive armored column taking up both lanes of the highway. The noise was apocalyptic, a deafening, thunderous roar that drowned out every other sound in the county. Leading the pack on his massive road king was Arthur Bear Sterling. Riding shoulder to shoulder with him was William Dutch Hollister, his president's patch gleaming in the morning sun. Behind them rode members from Oakland, San Jose, Vallejo, and nomads from across the Nevada border. Their cuts bore the infamous Death Head logo, a symbol of rebellion and fierce brotherhood now united under a single, unexpected cause. The local police force was instantly paralyzed. Sheriff Wayne Davies rushed out of the precinct, radioing for barricades, but it was useless. The sheer volume of motorcycles overwhelmed the streets. Traffic stopped entirely. People spilled out of the diner, out of the hardware store, out of their manicured suburban homes, standing on the sidewalks in stunned, open-mouthed disbelief as the terrifying procession rumbled past. Richard Preston and Principal Higgins pushed through the crowd outside the diner, watching in horror as the endless stream of bikers took the turn toward the poor side of town. "Where the hell are they going?" Preston demanded, his face turning pale as he realized the route led directly to St. Jude's. The procession pulled into the church's dirt parking lot. It wasn't nearly big enough. The bikers parked their heavy machines in perfect military-style rows, filling the lot, overflowing onto the dead grass of the lawns, and lining both sides of the street for a half-mile in either direction. When the engines were finally cut, the sudden sweeping silence that fell over the area was heavier and more intimidating than the roar had been. 700 massive, heavily tattooed, leather-clad men dismounted. The air smelled of hot exhaust, burning oil, and ozone. Chloe stood on the top step of the church. Her jaw dropped, her eyes wide with absolute awe. The sea of leather parted. Walking up the center of the pathway, looking like giants straight out of modern mythology, came Bear Dutch and the towering Sergeant-at-Arms, Iron Mike. Bear locked eyes with the little girl, a gentle, reassuring smile breaking through his thick beard. "Told you we'd be here, kid," Bear said, his deep voice carrying in the silent morning air. Sarah Miller stumbled out of the church doors behind her daughter, gasping as she took in the sight. Her legs gave out, and she slumped against the wooden doorframe, weeping not from sorrow but from a profound, overwhelming shock. The world that had completely abandoned her family had suddenly shown up in full force. "Ma'am," Dutch said, removing his sunglasses and nodding respectfully to Sarah. "I'm Dutch. We're here for Daniel." Before Sarah could formulate a sentence, the screech of tires shattered the moment. Sheriff Wayne Davies's cruiser, followed closely by Richard Preston's luxury SUV, hopped the curb and skidded to a halt near the front of the bikes. Preston leaped out of his car, his face purple with indignant rage. Sheriff Davies looked terrified, his hand resting hesitantly near his duty belt, heavily outmanned and completely out of his depth. "What is the meaning of this?" Preston shouted, marching toward the church steps. "You people don't have permits for a gathering of this size. This is a quiet town. You are disturbing the peace. Sheriff, arrest them for trespassing." 700 pairs of cold, hardened eyes turned to look at Richard Preston. The collective blare was enough to make the wealthy developer falter in his tracks. Dutch slowly turned around. He walked down the wooden steps, each heavy thud of his boots sounding like a judge's gavel. He stopped just inches from Preston's face. Dutch was a head taller, and his presence was overwhelmingly lethal. "Disturbing the peace?" Dutch asked, his voice deathly quiet, a deadly contrast to Preston's screeching. "Your son, Bradley, and his friends tormented a 16-year-old boy until he put a rope around his own neck. You and the rest of the cowards in this town decided to sweep it under the rug so your golden boy wouldn't lose his football scholarship. You threatened his neighbors. You made sure this church was empty." Preston swallowed hard, a bead of sweat rolling down his temple. That is unfounded slander. You're a gang of thugs." Dutch leaned in closer. "We are the Hells Angels, and we have a very low tolerance for bullies. You thought Daniel Miller had nobody. You thought you could erase him. Take a good look around, Mr. Preston. Take a good look at Daniel's family." Dutch gestured broadly to the sea of 700 patched bikers flanking the church, standing in stoic, immovable silence. "We are his family now," Dutch growled, "and we are going to bury our brother with the respect he deserves. If you or anyone else in this town ever speaks ill of this boy, or if anyone ever so much as looks at his little sister the wrong way, you won't be dealing with the school board. He'll be dealing with me. Now get off this property before I lose my temper." "Not Sheriff Davies immediately grabbed Preston by the elbow, physically dragging the sputtering, terrified man back to his SUV. The town's supposed elite sped away, fully realizing that the balance of power in Oydell had just permanently shifted. Dutch turned back to the church, his hard expression softening as he looked at Chloe. "Let's go say goodbye to your brother." The scene inside St. Jude's was unprecedented. The pews were packed shoulder to shoulder with massive bikers. They stood along the walls, filled the back vestibule, and spilled out the open doors. Men who had lived through prison, warfare, and the hardest roads imaginable took off their sunglasses and bowed their heads in absolute pin-drop silence as Mr. Bill Abernathy, shaking but profoundly moved, delivered the shortest, most well-attended funeral service of his career. When it was time to move the casket, Mr. Abernathy didn't need to ask for volunteers. Bear, Dutch, Iron Mike, and 3 other massive angels from the Oakland Charter stepped forward. They lifted the cheap pine box with effortless synchronized reverence. They carried Daniel Miller down the center aisle, passing through a gauntlet of respect that kings would envy. Out in the small, overgrown cemetery behind the church, the California sun beat down as the casket was lowered into the earth. Sarah Miller leaned heavily against Bear's side, drawing strength from the giant man who had kept his promise. As the service concluded, Dutch did something that left the attending members in stunned silence. The president reached into his cut and pulled out a small, custom-made piece of heavy black leather. It was a miniature vest. Sewn onto the back was a solitary, pristine patch. He stepped to the edge of the grave and gently dropped the leather down onto the casket. It was the ultimate sacred gesture. Daniel Miller, the boy who dreamed of riding free, the boy the town tried to discard, was going into the earth under the eternal protection of the club. Dutch looked across the grave at Chloe. "He's riding on the best highways now, little sister. Nobody can ever hurt him again." After the dirt was moved, the bikers didn't leave immediately. They stayed, shaking hands with a bewildered but deeply grateful Sarah Miller. They emptied their pockets, taking up a quiet collection that filled a helmet with enough cash to pay off the funeral expenses and ensure Chloe and her mother wouldn't have to worry about rent for a very long time. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the cemetery, the deep rumble of engines starting up signaled the end. The earth shook once more as the 700 riders formed up, a massive column of steel and Brotherhood preparing to head back to the highways they called home. Bear knelt down one last time in front of Chloe. He reached out and tapped her gently on the nose. "You remember what Dutch told that man today?" "Now, laxt, nad, amma." Chloe nodded, her eyes dry now, filled with a new, unbreakable, fierce light. "You're not alone anymore," Bear said, his voice thick with emotion. "You got 700 uncles watching your back. You ever need anything, you tell the wind, and we'll hear it." With a final nod, Bear mounted his Road King. He revved the engine, the thunderous sound blending with hundreds of others. As the massive convoy pulled out of the dirt lot, rolling out of Waldale to leave the town forever changed, Chloe stood on the steps of the church waving until the very last bike disappeared over the horizon. The bullies of Oildale never spoke Daniel's name in disrespect again. The town learned a harsh, unforgettable lesson about the true nature of courage, and a little girl named Chloe learned that sometimes the most profound love, protection, and brotherhood in the world doesn't come in a suit and tie. Sometimes it arrives on 2 wheels, wearing heavy leather and a scowl, ready to shake the gates of hell for the ones who cannot fight for themselves. If this incredible, real-life story of brotherhood and standing up to bullies touched your heart, please hit that like button and share this video with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss another powerful, true story. Drop a comment below to honor Daniel's memory. Ride free, and thank you for watching.